Chosen one. There comes a moment in your life that feels almost unreal because it is so different from the person you used to be. It does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears in a quiet moment after a conversation ends, after someone pulls away, after a familiar silence settles in, and you suddenly realize that the old panic is not there anymore. The fear that used to grip your chest when someone became distant does not rise the same way. The fear of being left, of being replaced, of being misunderstood, of being forgotten, of watching someone walk away and take your peace with them no longer has the same authority over your soul. At first, this change can feel strange because you remember how deeply attached you used to be. You remember the overthinking, the emotional spirals, the urge to fix every distance, explain every silence, chase every shift in someone's energy, and keep every connection alive no matter how much it cost you internally.
You remember how rejection once felt like a threat to your identity, how silence felt like abandonment, and how loss felt like something that could break your emotional foundation. You may have once measured your worth by who stayed close, who chose you, who understood you, who called, who responded, who made room for you, and who made you feel secure. But now, something has changed. You still care, you still love, you still value people, yet you are no longer ruled by the fear of losing them. This is where many chosen ones get misunderstood, because when this shift begins, people may call it coldness, detachment, or emotional shutdown. But that is not what this is. This is not bitterness. It is not numbness. It is not a hardened heart that no longer feels. It is a spiritual shift. It is the evidence that God has been working somewhere deeper than your emotions. He has been breaking the place inside you that once made human connection the center of your security. He has been teaching your soul that peace cannot be built on who stays. Stability cannot be built on who understands you. Identity cannot be built on who approves of you. Because as long as your emotional foundation rests in human attachment, your peace will always remain vulnerable to human inconsistency. And human beings are inconsistent. They change, they drift, they misunderstand, they disappoint, they leave, they return. They love imperfectly, and they often cannot carry the weight we place on them. God knows this. That is why He often allows emotional dependency to break in the life of a chosen one. Not because He wants them isolated, but because He refuses to let their soul stay anchored in something that can collapse so easily. The chosen one eventually reaches a place where they begin understanding this at a level deeper than words. They stop expecting people to be their peace. They stop asking relationships to do what only God was meant to do. And when that shift happens, fear loses its grip. The old terror of endings begins to weaken because you are no longer basing your spiritual stability on human permanence. You begin realizing that if someone leaves, God remains. If someone changes, God remains. If someone withdraws, misunderstands, or disappears, God remains. That truth may sound simple when spoken, but it takes real breaking, real healing, and real spiritual work before it becomes strong enough to reshape a person's inner life. Many chosen ones get to this place only after disappointment. God often has to allow relationships to expose how much emotional dependence had formed beneath the surface. He allows the separation, the delay, the silence, the unreturned effort, the shifting loyalties, and the painful realization that people cannot hold the place in your life that belongs to Him alone. In those moments, it can feel like loss, but later, you begin to see it as mercy. Because what God was really doing was cutting unhealthy dependence off at the root. He was teaching you that love can exist without bondage, that care can exist without panic, and that peace can remain even when people do not. This is one of the first signs that you are maturing spiritually. You stop collapsing over what used to control you. You stop turning every distance into a personal crisis. You stop negotiating your worth based on who stays closest. That does not mean you no longer feel sadness when someone leaves. It means sadness no longer becomes destruction. It means your emotions can move without your identity breaking apart. You can grieve without losing yourself. You can miss people without worshipping them. You can care deeply without needing them to remain in order for you to feel whole. This is why the chosen one becomes so different in this season. Their peace starts coming from somewhere deeper than attachment. It starts coming from alignment. God becomes the center again, and when that happens, a person's whole emotional structure changes. They become calmer, harder to manipulate, less desperate for reassurance, less willing to betray their peace just to keep someone from leaving. They no longer confuse possession with love or panic with loyalty. They begin walking with a different kind of strength, one that confuses people who are used to controlling them through emotional instability. Because the greatest shift is not just that you fear loss less. It is that you no longer believe losing a person means losing yourself. And that is when the chosen one begins stepping into a new level of freedom. But freedom like that rarely comes without a process. Before God could strengthen your calling, He first had to confront the places where people had become too central in your emotional world. Chosen one, before God could strengthen your calling, He had to confront the places in your heart where people had become too central. This is one of the most painful parts of spiritual growth, because attachment rarely looks dangerous when you are inside it. It often looks like love. It can feel like devotion, loyalty, deep care, or emotional sincerity. You may have believed you were simply loving people well, but underneath that love, there may have been something heavier shaping your reactions. You may have tied your worth to who chose you, who understood you, who stayed close, who responded quickly, who reassured you, and who made you feel safe. Without fully realizing it, you may have allowed certain people to become emotional anchors in places where only God was supposed to hold that authority. This is how unhealthy soul dependence forms. It does not always begin with obvious obsession. It begins quietly, through repeated emotional reliance. A certain person becomes the one whose approval steadies you. Another becomes the one whose presence makes you feel secure. Another becomes the one whose consistency determines whether your inner world feels calm or unsettled. Over time, the relationship may look normal from the outside, but spiritually, something has shifted out of order. Human connection has moved into a place of overdependence. Once that happens, fear enters the system almost automatically. Because whatever holds your emotional stability also gains the power to threaten it. If your worth is tied to who chooses you, then rejection becomes terrifying. If your peace is tied to who stays, then distance becomes destabilizing. If your identity is tied to being understood, then misunderstanding becomes overwhelming. This is why unhealthy attachment produces so much overthinking, people-pleasing, fear, and spiritual instability. You start analyzing every silence. You begin trying to manage how others perceive you. You overextend yourself to keep access. You become too willing to abandon your own clarity in order to preserve connection. And the entire time, you may call it loyalty when in reality, it is fear wearing the language of devotion. God sees this more clearly than you do while you are in it. He sees where your emotional dependence is quietly controlling your decisions, draining your peace, and weakening your ability to walk in purpose. That is why He often allows disappointment, distance, or separation to expose the attachment. Chosen ones do not usually get free from unhealthy dependence through one sermon or one realization. They often get free through heartbreak, through being let down, through being forced to sit in silence without the reassurance they once relied on.
through watching a connection shift in ways they cannot control, through the painful discovery that a person they leaned on emotionally cannot carry the weight they placed on them. In those moments, what you feel first is loss. But what God is often doing is exposure.
He is revealing how much of your inner stability had been handed over to human hands. He is showing you where your soul was too attached to what was never meant to hold you completely. This is why some separations feel deeper than the relationship itself. They are not only removing a person, they are confronting a structure inside you. They are cutting through the false belief that you cannot be whole unless someone remains. They are exposing the places where approval, closeness, and emotional reassurance have become substitutes for the kind of security only God can provide. And because God loves you too much to let anything sit in his place, he allows those false emotional anchors to break. What felt like loss was often God cutting unhealthy soul dependence. It did not feel merciful in the moment, because attachment always resists being removed. But over time, you begin seeing the wisdom in it. You realize that if those dependencies had remained, they would have kept controlling your peace. They would have kept you spiritually unstable, emotionally reactive, and vulnerable to manipulation. They would have kept you negotiating your obedience based on who might leave. And the chosen one cannot fully walk in purpose while being ruled by that fear. Purpose requires freedom. Calling requires internal order. God cannot place the full weight of destiny on a soul still anchored in human approval. This is why he sometimes allows the very relationships you thought you needed most to become the place where your dependence is confronted most directly. Not because he is cruel, but because he is freeing you. He is teaching you that love can be real without becoming worship, that connection can be meaningful without becoming your foundation, that care can remain deep without becoming bondage. This is one of the great turning points in the chosen one's life. The moment they stop asking people to be God for them. The moment they stop demanding emotional salvation from human connection. The moment they begin seeing that what they called heartbreak was often spiritual surgery. God was cutting away the false emotional center so that the real center could be restored. He was removing the human anchors so that your soul could finally learn what it feels like to be held by him alone. And once that process begins, something else starts changing. The panic weakens. The desperation decreases. The need to chase, beg, force, explain, and hold everything together begins fading. Because the deeper source of security is no longer sitting in the hands of people. It is beginning to return to God. And when that happens, the emotional power people once had over you starts breaking in ways that even they do not fully understand. Chosen one, the reason you no longer panic the way you used to is not because life suddenly became easier or because people became more reliable. It is because something deeper inside you has changed. God has begun replacing the place where fear once lived with a different kind of security. Before that shift, people had too much power over your internal world. Their silence could disturb your peace. Their distance could shake your confidence. Their inconsistency could pull you into overthinking, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. Even when you tried to stay strong, some part of you still depended on others to confirm that you were safe, valued, wanted, or secure. That is why certain relationships felt heavier than they should have. You were not only loving people, you were leaning on them for identity, stability, and reassurance in ways they were never designed to carry. But when God begins healing abandonment wounds and restoring spiritual order, something radical happens. The need that once made you chase starts weakening. The fear that once made you cling starts losing its authority. And gradually, almost quietly, people begin losing the emotional power they once had over you. This is one of the clearest signs that God is becoming your deeper foundation. You stop looking to human beings to tell you who you are.
You stop depending on constant approval to feel secure. You stop building your peace on whether someone is available, consistent, or easy to understand. Instead, your confidence begins rooting itself in divine truth. You start realizing that your value was never created by who chose you. Your worth was never dependent on who stayed longest. Your security was never supposed to rise and fall with human behavior. God begins teaching your soul that He is steady where people are not, faithful where people cannot be, and sufficient in places where others will always remain limited. This changes everything.
Because once God becomes your source, human instability stops hitting you with the same force it used to carry. You still notice change. You still feel loss. You still care when relationships shift. But the shift no longer takes your center with it. The difference is profound. Before, a person leaving could make you question yourself. Now, it may make you sad, but it does not dismantle your identity. Before, silence could send your mind spiraling. Now, silence may still be uncomfortable, but it no longer becomes a threat to your sense of self. Before, you might have begged for clarity, chased connection, or forced emotional labor in order to keep the relationship from collapsing. Now, something in you has become quieter, steadier, and far less desperate. That desperation was not love. It was fear mixed with dependence. And once God begins healing that place, people can no longer emotionally control you the same way.
This is why some individuals react strangely when they realize your old attachment is gone. They were used to your over-explaining. They were used to your need for reassurance. They were used to your willingness to chase, to fix, to keep reaching, to keep proving, to keep holding the bonds together even when they were offering inconsistency in return. That dynamic gave them power. They may not have named it that way, but it did. As long as your peace depended on them, they could influence your emotions through withdrawal, mixed signals, distance, or approval. But once God becomes your security, that leverage begins disappearing. You no longer beg for what should be given freely. You no longer panic every time someone shifts. You no longer collapse when people fail to show up the way you hoped. This creates a kind of peace that confuses those who once thought your weakness was attachment. They may call it coldness because they do not understand that what changed is not your ability to love, but your refusal to be ruled by fear. You have stopped making people the center of your emotional survival. You have stopped treating every ending like a verdict over your worth. You have stopped believing that someone's exit can cancel what God has for you. That is one of the most powerful freedoms a chosen one ever receives. When God becomes your deeper source of safety, people stop feeling like your only shelter. When He becomes your source of identity, rejection loses much of its poison. When He becomes your source of reassurance, human inconsistency no longer has the same access to your mind. This is why the new peace feels so unfamiliar at first. It is not the old peace that depended on people staying predictable. It is a deeper peace, one built on trust rather than control. You begin understanding something that once felt impossible to believe. Whoever is truly meant to remain will remain according to God's order, and whoever leaves cannot erase what He has planned for your life. That truth does not make you careless with people. It makes you freer with them. You can love without worshipping. You can care without collapsing. You can bless without clinging. You can value connection without confusing it for salvation. And this is where real emotional maturity starts becoming visible. You stop forcing loyalty. You stop chasing what is resisting. You stop shrinking your standards in order to keep access. You stop negotiating your peace for temporary companionship. The chosen one becomes different in this season because security rooted in God creates a soul that is much harder to manipulate. Guilt loses its grip.
Silence loses its power. Emotional withdrawal stops working the same way. The games that once unsettled you now expose themselves more quickly because your peace is no longer sitting in the hands of the people playing them. This is what happens when God becomes your foundation. Human instability no longer shakes your soul the same way. And once that foundation is established, He begins teaching you another lesson, just as important as security itself. The difference between loving people deeply and being bound to them in ways that distort love. Chosen one, once God begins becoming your security, He starts teaching you a lesson that changes the entire way you love, relate, and walk through the world. He teaches you the difference between loving people and being bound to them. This distinction is one of the deepest marks of spiritual maturity, because many people do not realize how often they confuse attachment with love. They think intensity means loyalty. They think constant emotional dependence means closeness. They think fear of losing someone is proof that the relationship matters deeply. But holy detachment reveals something far cleaner than that. It shows you that love does not have to be desperate in order to be real. It does not have to cling in order to be sincere. It does not have to collapse when someone changes, leaves, or disappoints you. God teaches the chosen one this lesson not through theory, but through experience. He lets them feel what happens when attachment breaks. He lets them face the silence they once feared, the distance they once chased, the endings they once thought would destroy them. And through that process, He rebuilds their love into something wiser. Holy detachment does not make you empty. It makes your love clean. It strips fear out of your care. It removes possession from your affection. It pulls panic out of your connection. And what remains is something much healthier than what you had before. You can still love deeply, but now you do not lose yourself inside the relationship. You can still bless people, but you do not need to possess them in order to feel whole. You can still care when someone leaves, but you no longer collapse as though their departure erased your peace, your future, or your identity. This is why holy detachment is not emotional numbness. It is emotional order. It is love that has been freed from idolatry. It is connection that has been separated from worship. It is the ability to let God remain at the center, even when your heart is engaged with people around you. Many chosen ones do not understand at first that God is trying to teach them this. They think He is making them hard, distant, or less loving because they no longer feel the same terror of losing people. But in reality, He is refining the quality of their love. Before, you may have loved in a way that was mixed with fear, control, overthinking, and the need to keep people close in order to feel safe. That kind of love can feel passionate, but it is not free. It is burdened. It is unstable. It rises and falls with access, reassurance, and emotional consistency from other people. Holy detachment changes that. It teaches you that real love does not need to manipulate, chase, or beg. It does not need to make idols out of relationships. It does not need to fear endings more than it fears disobedience to God. This is one of the clearest signs that the chosen one is growing up spiritually. Their priorities begin shifting. They stop worshiping relationships. They stop chasing validation. They stop negotiating their convictions in order to stay emotionally comfortable with people who were never assigned to stay forever. Instead, they begin walking with a different kind of calm. They can enjoy people without building their identity on them. They can release what is leaving without turning the loss into a crisis of worth. They can accept that some people were meant for a chapter and not the entire journey. This acceptance does not come from cynicism. It comes from spiritual clarity. God teaches them that not everyone is assigned to walk with them forever. And the sooner they stop demanding permanence from temporary relationships, the freer their love becomes. This kind of maturity makes the chosen one stronger, calmer, and far more difficult to manipulate.
Unhealthy dynamics depend on your fear. They depend on your desperation to keep access, your urge to preserve connection at any cost, your willingness to shrink your standards so that someone will not leave. But the moment you are no longer scared of losing access to people, something in those dynamics breaks. Guilt starts losing its grip. Emotional pressure stops working the same way. Threats of withdrawal no longer create the panic they once produced.
That is why holy detachment is dangerous to unhealthy relationships. The moment the chosen one no longer fears endings more than dishonoring God, the old manipulations start failing. People who are comfortable when you are attached may become uncomfortable when you become free. They may call your peace distance. They may call your maturity coldness. They may say you changed because they were more comfortable with a version of you that was easier to emotionally control. But what they are witnessing is not loss of heart. It is the cleansing of it. God is not making you less loving. He is making your love less bound. He is teaching you how to care without chains, how to bless without bondage, and how to remain open-hearted without becoming spiritually entangled in everything you touch. This is why the chosen one becomes calmer in this stage. They're no longer trying to force what God did not assign. They're no longer terrified of every shift in human closeness. They are learning to love from abundance instead of fear. And when love comes from abundance, it no longer needs to control outcomes in order to stay alive. It can release. It can trust. It can let seasons end without treating every ending like death. That kind of love is holy because it belongs to God first. And once He teaches you that, another transformation begins to unfold. You become less concerned with losing people and far more concerned with losing alignment with Him. That is where real authority begins. Chosen one, the greatest transformation happens when your deepest concern is no longer losing people, but losing alignment with God. This is the moment everything begins changing at the root. Before, much of your emotional life may have revolved around preserving connection. You wanted peace, but sometimes that peace depended on who was near you. You wanted stability, but sometimes that stability depended on whether people stayed consistent. You wanted clarity, but sometimes you were willing to silence your own discernment just to avoid conflict, rejection, or separation. In that season, relationships had too much power over your internal world because your priorities were still mixed. You feared loss more than misalignment. You feared endings more than compromise. You feared standing alone more than standing out of order with God. But when the Lord truly begins changing a chosen one, that order gets reversed. Slowly, then deeply, your heart starts caring more about obedience than acceptance. You become more concerned with protecting your peace than preserving every connection. You become more alert to spiritual compromise than emotional discomfort. And that is when a new kind of authority begins forming in your life. Because the person who no longer fears losing people above losing God cannot be controlled in the same way anymore. Their priorities have shifted too far. Their inner foundation has moved too deep. The old triggers do not work like they used to. Silence no longer terrifies them. Withdrawal no longer manipulates them. Guilt no longer keeps them chained to what drains them. Emotional pressure no longer bends them the same way. This is what makes a chosen one spiritually dangerous to unhealthy dynamics. The moment they stop worshipping access, the people who once used access as leverage begin losing their power. The moment they stop shrinking to keep others comfortable, the atmosphere around them starts changing. The moment they would rather stand alone with God than stay entangled with what weakens their spirit, fear begins losing its throne. This is why this stage of growth feels so different. It is not simply that you became stronger emotionally. It is that your fear changed direction. You no longer primarily fear abandonment, rejection, or being misunderstood. You begin fearing something else much more deeply. Grieving God, missing His voice, betraying your peace, or stepping out of alignment with what He is building in you. That holy fear does not make you anxious. It makes you anchored. It clears your priorities. It teaches you that temporary companionship is never worth permanent confusion. It shows you that being chosen by God matters more than being chosen by people. It reminds you that approval without peace is expensive, closeness without clarity is dangerous, and loyalty without truth is not spiritual maturity. This shift creates unusual boldness in a chosen one. You stop negotiating with dynamics that once held you hostage. You stop trying to rescue every relationship that God is already leading you away from. You stop apologizing for boundaries that preserve what heaven is protecting. You stop making your calling wait for people who are still attached to the version of you that was easier to influence, guilt, or control. This does not mean you become careless with others. It means you become clear. And clarity is powerful because it removes the fog that fear once lived in. You start recognizing that anyone who must be kept through self-betrayal is too expensive to keep. Anyone who requires you to abandon peace in order to remain close is misaligned with your next level of growth. Anyone who can only stay connected to you when you are anxious, over-available, or emotionally dependent was never loving your freedom in the first place. Once you see that, your life begins entering a new level of spiritual order. You stop chasing what is leaving. You stop proving what God already established. You stop building your emotional world around unstable people and start building it around divine truth. And that is why this stage feels so powerful. Not because you became detached from humanity, but because you became attached to the right center. When God becomes enough for you, your life changes at the source. You do not stop loving people. You stop making them your foundation. You do not stop feeling pain. You stop treating pain like proof that you must go back to what God is asking you to release. You do not stop valuing connection. You stop confusing connection with identity. This is what makes the chosen one unstoppable in this season. Not perfection, not emotional numbness, but order. The right thing is finally in the highest place. God is first. His voice matters more than the crowd. His peace matters more than someone's approval. His direction matters more than temporary comfort. And when that order is restored, the soul becomes much harder to shake. People can still leave, misunderstand, or withdraw, but they can no longer take your center with them. They can no longer threaten your destiny by withholding themselves. They can no longer make you betray your peace just to keep proximity alive. This is freedom. This is maturity. This is authority. The chosen one who reaches this point no longer lives trying to avoid loss at all costs. They live trying to remain aligned at all costs. And that changes everything. Your priorities become cleaner. Your mind becomes quieter. Your love becomes wiser. Your presence becomes stronger. Your boundaries become holier. You would rather be misunderstood with peace than accepted in confusion. You would rather lose access to people than lose intimacy with God. You would rather stand in obedience alone than sit in emotional compromise with a crowd. That is why this stage is so powerful. Because when God becomes enough for you, your life enters a new level of freedom, strength, and spiritual clarity. You stop fearing the wrong things. You stop bowing to the wrong altars. You stop calling bondage love. And from that place, the chosen one becomes something the world does not easily know how to handle. A person with nothing left to prove, and no one left to fear losing above God. Before we close, take a moment to reflect on this message.
If you've noticed that the fear of losing people no longer controls you the way it once did, that may not be emotional numbness. It may be evidence that God has been healing, strengthening, and repositioning your heart. If this message spoke directly to your season, like this video so it can reach others who need the same confirmation. Share it with someone who is learning how to let go without losing themselves. And if you want more content about the Chosen One journey, spiritual maturity, and God-centered transformation, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next message.